The Arizona sun blazed mercilessly as Martha Maddie O'Brien crawled through the rocky scrubland, her hands torn and bleeding from the sharp stones. Each labored breath drew in scorching air that seared her lungs. The threadbare cotton dress that had once been blue was now stained with dust and sweat, clinging to her weathered frame. At 51, the Irish widow had survived the potato famine, buried a husband in a mine collapse, and raised 3 sons who'd scattered to the 4 winds. But she'd never imagined dying alone in the Sonoran Desert, betrayed by her own flesh and blood. Aunt Maddie's lost her mind. Danny O'Brien had told the other miners in Tombstone, his handsome face twisted with false concern. Thinks she can work a claim like a man. Time someone taught her the facts of life out here. Those facts had included drugging her coffee with laudanum stolen from Doc Holliday's office, stealing her claim papers while she lay unconscious, and dumping her 20 miles from town without water or supplies. The memory of his final words burned hotter than the desert sun. Should have stayed back in Boston, tending house like a proper widow, he'd sneered before riding away with her life savings. $342 sewn into the lining of her trunk, and the deed to the silver mine her late husband had died finding. The deed that represented her last chance at independence in a world that had no place for aging widows. Maddie's vision blurred as she spotted a ramshackle cabin nestled against a cliff face. The structure seemed to waver in the heat, a mirage she feared might disappear if she blinked. Smoke rose from its stone chimney, the first sign of human life she'd seen in 2 days of desperate crawling. With her last ounce of strength, she dragged herself across the final stretch of sun-baked earth, leaving a trail in the dust like a wounded animal. Her cracked fingernails broke further as she pounded weakly on the weathered door, the sound barely audible even to her own ears. The door opened with a protesting creak of leather hinges to reveal a giant of a man, easily 6.5 feet tall, with skin dark as mahogany and scars crisscrossing his massive arms. His face, framed by a close-cropped salt-and-pepper beard, bore the marks of a hard life. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, and his nose had been broken at least once. Former slave turned prospector, Ezekiel Big Zeke Washington had fled north after Reconstruction failed, seeking freedom in the lawless territories where a man's worth was measured by his courage, not his color. "Lord have mercy," Zeke rumbled, his voice like distant thunder rolling across the desert. "What's a white woman doing dying on my doorstep?" "Not dying yet," Maddie gasped, her Irish accent thickened by dehydration. "Though it's a near thing." She tried to rise, to maintain some dignity, but her limbs betrayed her, and she collapsed at his feet. Zeke studied her with eyes that had seen too much cruelty to trust easily. Those eyes had witnessed the auction block, the overseer's whip, and the broken promises of freedom. But something in her defiant spirit reminded him of his own mother, who died fighting for her children's freedom. Without another word, he bent down and lifted Maddie's slight frame as if she weighed nothing, carrying her inside the cabin that smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and the sharp tang of mining chemicals. For 3 days, Maddie drifted between consciousness and fever dreams, while Zeke spooned water between her cracked lips and muttered about fool women coming to the desert unprepared. In her delirium, she called out for Patrick, her long-dead husband, and for her sons. Michael in San Francisco, Thomas somewhere in Colorado, and young James who joined the cavalry and hadn't written in 2 years. Zeke listened to these fragments of a life, piecing together the story of a woman who'd already endured more than most. His cabin was sparse but clean, with mining equipment stacked in one corner and a small library of books, unusual for a man most assumed couldn't read. A Winchester rifle hung above the stone fireplace, well-oiled and ready. A single window faced east, catching the morning light but avoiding the worst of the afternoon heat. When Maddie finally sat up, clear-headed on the 4th day, Zeke was reading by lamplight, his massive finger following the words in a worn copy of Shakespeare's The Tempest. The incongruity of this giant man absorbed in literature might have made her smile under different circumstances. "You're awake," he observed without looking up from his page. "Thought you might not make it through last night. Fever broke around dawn." "I'm tougher than I look," Maddie replied, her voice raspy but stronger. She studied her unlikely savior with new clarity, noting the intelligence in his eyes that belied his rough appearance. "You read Shakespeare?" "Taught myself after freedom came. Books don't care what color your skin is." His tone carried decades of bitter experience. "Found this one in a burned-out schoolhouse in Tennessee. Teacher there had been trying to educate colored children before the Klan ran her out." Maddie nodded, understanding more than he said. She'd seen similar hatred directed at Irish immigrants in Boston, though she knew it paled beside what this man had endured. "I'm Martha O'Brien. Most call me Maddie. Ezekiel Washington. Zeke to those who don't mean me harm." He closed his book and fixed her with a penetrating gaze. "Now, what brings a white woman to crawl half-dead through Apache territory?" The story spilled out like water from a broken dam. Danny's betrayal? The stolen claim? Years of savings lost to family treachery. She told him about Patrick's death in the mine collapse 5 years earlier, how she'd kept his mining journals and studied them until she understood the geology of silver deposits better than most men who'd spent their lives underground, how she'd followed her nephew west after her sons left home, believing family was family, only to discover that blood ties meant nothing compared to greed. Zeke listened without comment, occasionally nodding as if he'd heard similar tales before. His massive hands, capable of crushing stone, gently stoked the fire as night fell, and the desert chill crept into the cabin. "This nephew of yours," he said finally, breaking the long silence, "you think being young and white makes him smart?" "Something like that." Maddie's mouth twisted in a bitter smile. "He's Patrick's brother's boy. Always had more charm than sense, but I never thought he'd leave his own kin to die." Zeke rose to his full height, stretching muscles knotted from hours of sitting. "Men like that forget that surviving out here takes more than arrogance. Takes knowing the land, reading the signs, understanding that the desert don't care about your age or your color. It'll kill you just the same." He moved to a crude cupboard and pulled out a bottle of whiskey and 2 tin cups. "Medicine," he explained, pouring a finger in each. "For what ails the spirit, not just the body." The liquor burned going down, but Maddie welcomed the warmth that spread through her chest. It had been years since she'd indulged in spirits. Proper Boston widows didn't drink, after all, but proper Boston widows didn't end up half dead in the desert either. When Maddie was strong enough to stand 3 days later, Zeke made an unexpected offer. They were sharing a simple breakfast of cornbread and coffee when he cleared his throat with deliberate purpose. "I know that claim your nephew stole," he said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "Worked near there for months before moving to this spot. Good silver, but dangerous. Apache territory, flash flood country. Boy's gonna get himself killed trying to work it alone." "What are you suggesting?" Maddie asked, though something in his expression told her she already knew. "Partnership." The word hung in the air between them, radical and dangerous. "I know the land, you know mining. Your husband taught you, didn't he? We work together, split whatever we find, 50-50. Maddie stared at him, searching for signs of mockery or deceit and finding none. "You'd trust a stranger? A white woman?" Zeke's laugh was like rocks tumbling down a mountainside, startling in its genuine amusement. "Lady, we're both outcasts in this territory. You're too old, I'm too black. Might as well be outcasts together." His expression sobered. "Besides, I've watched men and women alike in this desert. It's not strength that keeps you alive out here, it's wisdom. And you've got plenty of that." Their partnership began with a dangerous journey to Devil's Canyon, where Maddie's original claim lay hidden in Apache country. They traveled by night when possible, avoiding the worst of the heat and the most traveled routes where questions might be asked about their unusual pairing. Zeke taught her to find water in seemingly dry creek beds, to identify edible plants, and to move silently through the landscape. "Desert's alive," he explained as they crouched behind a boulder, watching a rattlesnake slither past. "Just speaks a different language than most folks understand." The mine entrance was barely visible, carved into a cliff face that required ropes and nerves of steel to reach. A natural chimney in the rock provided ventilation, but the approach was treacherous, a narrow ledge barely wide enough for a man's foot, with a 100-foot drop to jagged rocks below. "No wonder Danny abandoned it," Maddie observed as they surveyed the site from a distance. Boy never did like heights. Fool boys scratching for table scraps, Zeke observed as they rappelled down the cliff face the next morning, using ropes he'd brought from his cabin. Real silver's always in the hard places. Inside the mine, Maddie's knowledge proved invaluable. She could read the rock formations like a book, identifying the richest veins with an expertise that impressed even Zeke. Her late husband had taught her well before the cave-in claimed his life, and she'd expanded that knowledge through years of study. There, she said, pointing to a glittering seam deep in the tunnel. That's what Patrick died trying to reach. See how the quartz changes color here? That's our marker. They worked in shifts. Maddie's smaller frame, perfect for navigating the narrow passages, Zeke's strength essential for hauling out the ore. They developed a rhythm, communicating with the shorthand of experienced miners who understand that underground, words are secondary to instinct and observation. Within weeks, they'd extracted more silver than Danny had managed in months of surface scratching. They established a camp near the mine entrance, building a small shelter against the cliff face that blended with the natural rock. Zeke constructed an ingenious pulley system to transport ore down to a hidden processing area where they crushed and separated the silver using techniques he'd learned from Mexican miners further south. But success brought attention. Word spread through Tombstone about the unlikely partnership working the Devil's Canyon claim. Some folks were curious, others hostile. A black man and an aging Irish widow working together challenged too many assumptions about how the world was supposed to work. The whispers reached the Cosmopolitan Hotel, where Danny O'Brien had been spending Maddie's savings on whiskey and women, boasting about his mining success, while the real work happened miles away. When he heard that his abandoned claim was producing silver, his rage was matched only by his embarrassment. The trouble started when Danny rode into their camp with 3 hired guns, confident that intimidation would solve his problem. He found Maddie and Zeke calmly eating dinner by their campfire, seemingly unaware of the approaching threat. "Well, well," Danny called out, his voice slurred with whiskey and false bravado. "If it ain't my dear old aunt, playing house with her pet darky." Maddie looked up from her plate, her expression mild despite the slur that made Zeke's jaw tighten. "Danny, you're looking poorly, desert life not agreeing with you?" Danny's once handsome face had indeed deteriorated in the weeks since his betrayal. His skin was reddened from sun and drink, his eyes bloodshot, his clothes stained despite their expensive cut. The silver he'd stolen had brought him nothing but dissolution. "Don't get smart with me, old woman. You're trespassing on my claim." "Your claim?" Maddie's voice remained conversational, but Zeke noticed her hand drift toward the rifle leaning against her chair. "Funny thing about that, seems the territorial office has some questions about how you acquired those papers, especially since the original deed is safely registered in my name." Danny's face flushed red beneath his sunburn. "You lying?" "Careful, boy," Zeke interrupted, rising to his full imposing height. "You're talking to a lady." One of Danny's hired guns, a Weasley man named Crenshaw, with a reputation for killing Chinese miners in California, spat tobacco juice near Zeke's feet. "Uppity nigger thinks he can tell white men what to do." The confrontation exploded into violence with shocking speed. Crenshaw went for his gun, confident in his reputation as a fast draw. He never cleared leather. Zeke's massive fist caught him in the temple, dropping him like a felled tree. The other 2 gunmen hesitated, suddenly realizing they'd underestimated their opponents. That hesitation cost them. Maddie's rifle spoke twice, precise shots that shattered their gun hands without killing them. Years of hunting game for the pot had made her aim deadly accurate. Danny found himself facing 2 people who'd survived everything the frontier could throw at them, and discovered that experience trumped youth every time. His own gun remained holstered, his courage evaporating as quickly as water in the desert sun. "Here's what's going to happen," Maddie said, her rifle trained on her nephew's chest. "You're going to ride back to Tombstone and tell everyone that you made a mistake about this claim. Then you're going to disappear. California, Oregon, I don't care where. But if I see your face again, I'll put a bullet in it." "You can't." "I can and I will," Maddie replied with deadly calm. I'm a 51-year-old widow with nothing left to lose and everything to protect. That makes me the most dangerous person you'll ever meet." Danny O'Brien left Devil's Canyon that night and never returned to Tombstone. Some said he'd headed for the California goldfields, others that he'd gone to Mexico. A few whispered that he'd been found dead in a Tucson alley, victim of a card game gone wrong. The truth was lost to the vast spaces of the frontier, where men disappeared daily without leaving a trace. Maddie O'Brien didn't much care either way. She'd found something more valuable than silver in the harsh beauty of the Arizona desert. She'd found partnership, purpose, and proof that survival had nothing to do with age or gender, and everything to do with courage and determination. 6 months later, the Devil's Canyon mine was the most productive claim in the territory. Maddie and Zeke had built a reputation for fairness that extended from Tombstone to Tucson. They employed other outcasts, aging prospectors, freed slaves, Mexican vaqueros who'd lost their ranches to Anglo settlers, even a Chinese cook named Lin who'd escaped the railroad camps. Their operation grew to include a small stamp mill where ore was processed, a trading post that served travelers regardless of color or background, and eventually a school where Zeke taught reading to anyone willing to learn. The settlement that grew around the mine became known as Redemption, a place where the past mattered less than what a person was willing to contribute. "We're building something here," Maddie told Zeke one evening as they watched the sunset paint the canyon walls gold and crimson. They sat on the porch of the cabin they'd built to replace their original shelter, drinking coffee laced with whiskey and watching their workers head home to their families. "Something that matters." "Building a family," Zeke agreed, his deep voice thoughtful. "Choosing our own kin instead of being stuck with the ones we're born to." At 52, Maddie O'Brien was no longer the desperate widow who'd crawled through the desert seeking help. She was a businesswoman, a leader, and living proof that in the American West, reinvention was always possible for those brave enough to seize it. The desert that had nearly killed her had instead forged her into something stronger than she'd ever imagined. A woman who'd learned that true wealth wasn't measured in silver or gold, but in the bonds forged between people who'd chosen to stand together against a world that wanted to tear them apart. And Ezekiel Washington had found something he'd thought lost forever when the chains were broken. Not just freedom, but belonging, partnership with someone who saw his worth beyond the color of his skin. Together, they'd carved out their own piece of the American dream in the unforgiving landscape of the frontier, proving that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships create the strongest foundations, and that legends are born not from easy victories, but from the dust and struggle of those who refuse to surrender to fate.